Welcome back to Stoic Golden Tribe, where we explore the emotional truths most people discover too late. If you've ever felt someone slowly becoming emotionally distant without fully understanding why, this video may explain more than you expect. And by the end of this conversation, you may begin seeing relationship silence very differently. Most men think emotional distance happens suddenly. One day everything feels normal, and the next day she feels cold, disconnected, emotionally unavailable, but that is almost never how it actually begins. The truth is, women rarely pull away emotionally overnight. The signs usually start much earlier. Small emotional shifts, subtle changes in energy, tiny moments most men ignore because they seem harmless. And that is exactly why the damage becomes dangerous. Because by the time the distance becomes obvious, the emotional disconnection has often been growing quietly for months, sometimes years. And the painful part is this: many men only start paying attention after the emotional warmth is already fading, but by then, the relationship may already be emotionally exhausted. And what makes this even more heartbreaking is that many of these signs do not look dramatic at first. They look normal, until one day, the silence feels permanent. One of the earliest signs of emotional withdrawal is not anger. It is emotional reduction. The relationship slowly loses emotional depth. Not all at once, but little by little. She stops sharing certain thoughts, stops expressing emotional excitement, stops bringing emotional energy into conversations. And most men completely misunderstand this stage because technically, nothing looks wrong. There are no major arguments, no explosive conflict, no obvious breakup conversation. Life simply starts feeling emotionally flatter. And this is where many relationships quietly begin weakening, because men often wait for dramatic signs before taking emotional distance seriously. But emotional disconnection rarely begins dramatically. It usually begins silently. You may notice shorter conversations, less emotional curiosity, reduced affection, less enthusiasm, delayed responses, emotional tiredness. And at first, these changes seem temporary: stress, life, age, responsibilities. So the warning signs get ignored. But this is where things become dangerous, because emotional withdrawal often grows strongest in silence, not conflict, silence. And the longer emotional silence continues, the harder emotional safety becomes to rebuild, especially later in life. Because after 60, people protect their emotional energy more carefully. They stop fighting for connection the same way they did when they were younger. Instead, they quietly detach. And many men never realize this is happening until the emotional warmth has already disappeared. But the silence itself is not the real problem. The real problem is what the silence usually represents emotionally, and that is where many relationships quietly break down, without either person fully understanding why. This is where many men accidentally make the situation worse, because once they finally notice the emotional distance, they panic, not always outwardly, but internally, and that fear quietly changes their behavior. Suddenly they begin trying to fix everything quickly: more texting, more checking in, more emotional pressure, more forced conversations, and unfortunately, that usually pushes her even further away, because emotional withdrawal is rarely solved through pressure. It is solved through emotional safety. And many people do not understand the difference. When a woman begins emotionally disconnecting, she is often not looking for perfection. She is looking for emotional understanding. But instead of slowing down and observing the emotional shift carefully, many men become reactive. And reactions created from fear usually feel emotionally heavy, especially to someone who is already emotionally overwhelmed. This is why some women become quieter after emotional tension appears, not because they hate the man, not because love completely disappeared, but because the relationship no longer feels emotionally calm. And this part becomes even more painful later in life, because after decades of emotional disappointment, heartbreak, stress, sacrifice, and exhaustion, people become extremely sensitive to emotional pressure. Even small emotional tension starts feeling draining. And this is the mistake most men never notice. They focus entirely on communication, while ignoring emotional atmosphere. But emotional atmosphere changes everything. You can say all the right words and still make someone feel emotionally unsafe. You can ask, "What's wrong?" every day, while completely missing the emotional exhaustion underneath the silence. And eventually, the relationship begins feeling emotionally heavy instead of emotionally peaceful. That is when emotional closeness starts collapsing faster. Because emotional attraction does not survive constant emotional tension. It survives emotional safety, calmness, emotional steadiness. And this is where Stoic emotional presence becomes powerful. Not emotional suppression, not coldness, but calm emotional awareness. The ability to notice emotional changes without immediately reacting from fear. Because the moment fear controls your behavior, the relationship often becomes emotionally unstable. And women feel that instability faster than most men realize. But what happens next is even more dangerous, because once emotional disconnection continues long enough, people stop expressing their needs completely. And when that stage begins, the relationship enters a very different kind of silence. This is the stage that quietly shocks many men later, because by this point, the arguments often become smaller, not bigger. The emotional complaints become less frequent, not more frequent. And many men mistakenly think, maybe things are finally calming down. But sometimes the opposite is happening, because when a woman stops repeatedly explaining her emotional needs, it can mean emotional fatigue has already started replacing emotional hope. And that shift is dangerous, not because the relationship is automatically over, but because emotional investment often begins decreasing silently at this stage. This is what many people fail to understand about emotional withdrawal. When someone still argues emotionally, there is usually still emotional energy involved, still emotional fighting, still emotional effort, still emotional desire to be understood. But when emotional exhaustion fully settles in, the energy changes completely. The relationship becomes quieter, colder, emotionally distant in subtle ways. And this is where many men finally begin feeling confused, because externally, everything may still appear functional. You still talk, still eat together, still maintain routines, still act normal around other people, but emotionally, something deeper has disappeared. And the painful part is this: many men only start becoming emotionally attentive once they feel her emotionally drifting away completely. That is when they suddenly begin trying harder, trying to reconnect, trying to communicate more, trying to become emotionally available. But unfortunately, delayed emotional awareness often arrives after emotional exhaustion has already been growing for a long time, and rebuilding emotional safety becomes much harder once someone emotionally stops expecting change, especially after 60, because older adults usually value emotional peace more than emotional intensity. They no longer want relationships that feel emotionally draining. Even love itself starts feeling different later in life. People become less attracted to emotional excitement and more attracted to emotional calmness, consistency, safety, peace, emotional steadiness. And when those things slowly disappear, emotional detachment quietly begins replacing emotional closeness. But this is the part nobody talks about. Sometimes the relationship does not collapse because of one massive betrayal. Sometimes it collapses because two people slowly stop feeling emotionally seen. And that emotional invisibility creates a loneliness that is difficult to explain, especially when two people are still physically close, but emotionally far apart. And unfortunately, this final stage is where many people suddenly realize the emotional distance had been growing much longer than they ever imagined. One of the saddest realities about emotional distance is that many people do not recognize it while it is happening. Because emotional disconnection rarely announces itself loudly, it grows quietly, through small emotional neglects, small emotional absences, small moments of disconnection repeated over time, and eventually, two people who once felt emotionally close begin feeling emotionally unfamiliar to each other, not because they planned to, but because emotional connection was slowly left unattended. And this is why emotional awareness matters so much later in life, because after 60, people no longer have endless emotional energy for unstable relationships. They become more protective of their peace, more protective of emotional safety, more sensitive to tension, pressure, emotional confusion, and emotional inconsistency. And many women reach a point where they stop asking for emotional understanding completely, not because they never cared, but because emotional exhaustion convinced them nothing would change. That is the silence many men misunderstand. It is not always hatred, not always loss of love. Sometimes it is emotional resignation, and emotional resignation is dangerous because it often happens quietly. No dramatic announcement, no massive explosion, just gradual emotional disappearance, less emotional effort, less emotional openness, less emotional vulnerability, until eventually, the relationship no longer feels emotionally alive. And the painful truth is this: many men are not bad people. They simply notice emotional damage too late. They wait for visible collapsing, while emotional distance has already been growing underneath the surface for a very long time. But awareness changes everything, because once you understand how emotional withdrawal actually begins, you stop focusing only on obvious conflict and you start paying attention to emotional atmosphere, the energy between two people, the emotional safety, the calmness, the feeling of being emotionally understood. Because love later in life is rarely sustained by excitement alone. It survives through emotional steadiness, presence, patience, emotional maturity, and the ability to notice small emotional shifts before silence becomes permanent. Sometimes the most painful relationships are not the ones destroyed by betrayal, but the ones slowly weakened by emotional distance nobody fully understood while it was happening. And unfortunately, many people only recognize the warning signs after the emotional connection already feels difficult to recover. That is why emotional awareness matters, not fear, not panic, awareness. Because the strongest relationships later in life are usually built by people who learn how to protect emotional peace before emotional exhaustion takes over. If this video spoke to something you've personally experienced, leave a comment below with the word awareness and tell me honestly, have you ever noticed emotional distance too late? Also, if you enjoy these deeper emotional truths about relationships, masculinity, emotional intelligence, and human behavior later in life, subscribe to Stoic Golden Tribe, because on this channel, we talk about the emotional realities most people only understand after it hurts.